For centuries, Africa's wealth has flowed outward. Resources extracted from its soil were sent across oceans, refined in foreign lands, and sold back at prices set by others. The riches that should have built African empires instead built the fortunes of those who saw the continent as nothing more than a supplier of raw materials. But now, something is changing. Senegal has done what many believed was impossible. It is refining its oil, not in France, not in a foreign-controlled facility, but on its land, with its people, for its future. This is not just an industrial achievement, it is a power shift. It is a declaration that Africa will no longer ask permission to control its wealth. Crude oil from Senegal's own Sangomar field is being refined at the Société Africaine de Raffinage for the first time. Not oil imported from foreign markets, not resources dictated by foreign contracts. This is oil from the soil of Africa, processed by the hands of its people. And yet the world is in shock. They said this would never happen. They said Africa would always be dependent, always at the mercy of those who control the industries that power the world. But today, in the heart of Dakar, the flames of a refinery burn, not just with oil, but with defiance.
So Senegal has officially launched its first ever oil refinery. It's a major move that has the potential to change the game, not just for the West African nation, but for the entire continent.
But how did Senegal do that? Let's find out. For far too long, Africa has been rich in resources, but poor in power. The wealth of the continent has been its greatest curse, plundered century after century, leaving behind a trail of underdevelopment, exploitation, and economic control by foreign powers. Every African nation has felt this burden in some form, and Senegal is no exception. The story of its oil is the same story that has played out in nations across Africa. A story of promises made, contracts signed, and wealth siphoned away before it could ever benefit its people. When oil was first discovered off Senegal's coast, it should have been a turning point. A moment where the country could use its natural wealth to build industries, strengthen its economy, and lift its people out of dependence. Instead, it became yet another resource controlled by outside interests. Western corporations, backed by governments that have long dictated Africa's economic policies, ensured that the crude extracted from Senegalese land and waters would leave the continent to be refined elsewhere. The system was designed so that even the oil beneath Senegalese soil would generate more profits for foreign markets than for Senegal itself. This is not unique to Senegal. This is the colonial blueprint that Africa has lived under for generations. The industries that refine raw materials, that create finished products, and that generate real wealth have always been placed outside of Africa. The continent has been locked in a cycle where it extracts, exports, and then imports back what it should have been able to produce for itself. The result? A continent overflowing with resources but struggling to control its destiny. Senegal's oil industry was set up to serve external interests from the very beginning. The Société Africaine de Raffinage, established in 1961, should have been a milestone in African industrialization. But like so many projects during the post-independence period, it was structured in a way that kept true economic power out of African hands. Rather than refining its crude, Senegal was refining imported oil, meaning it was still at the mercy of global oil markets, still dependent on foreign suppliers, and still forced to operate within an energy system designed by outsiders. For decades, Africa's greatest struggle has not been a lack of resources but a lack of control over those resources. From oil in Nigeria and Angola to gold in Ghana and South Africa, from uranium in Niger to copper in Zambia, the continent has been systematically stripped of its ability to benefit from its wealth. The infrastructure needed to refine, manufacture, and process raw materials was deliberately kept outside of Africa, ensuring that economic power remained elsewhere. This is why Senegal's decision to refine its oil is not just a business decision. It is an act of defiance against a system that was built to keep Africa on the margins of global wealth. The historical reality is clear. No nation has ever become powerful by exporting its raw materials and letting others profit from refining them. The West did not rise to economic dominance by selling unprocessed resources. China did not become an industrial powerhouse by shipping its raw goods abroad and waiting for finished products to return. Every major economic power has one thing in common: it controls the industries that turn resources into wealth. Yet, Africa has been told for generations that its role is different. It should focus on extraction while others handle the complex industries. That it should be satisfied with exporting its gold, diamonds, oil, and minerals while other nations refine, manufacture, and profit. This lie has been the foundation of global economic structures, keeping Africa locked in a state of dependency. Senegal is breaking this cycle. It is taking a step that many African countries have been denied for decades. By refining its crude, it is rejecting the old model that dictated Africa's place in the world economy. It is proving that African nations do not have to accept a future where their wealth is forever controlled by others. This is why the world is watching. This is why headlines are being written. When a country takes control of its resources, it challenges the entire economic order that has kept Africa in a position of weakness. The moment Senegal began refining its oil, it sent a clear message, not just to its people, but to every African nation that has been told they cannot do the same. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. For centuries, Africa has been the source of global wealth, but has never been its beneficiary. That era is coming to an end. Senegal is leading the way, and others will follow. The chains of dependency are not unbreakable. They have only remained intact because African nations have been told they must wear them. But now, a new path is being forged, one that leads to true economic independence. The refinery flames that burn in Dakar today are not just processing crude oil. They are burning down the old order. They are illuminating the future of a continent that refuses to be controlled any longer. Senegal has taken back what is rightfully its own, and the world is beginning to understand that Africa is no longer playing by their rules. Now the question is, what will this mean for Africa? For decades, Africa has been told to wait for investment, wait for expertise, wait for foreign companies to come in and build industries that Africans, according to colonial narratives, could not build for themselves. This waiting game has been Africa's greatest economic trap, one that has kept the continent rich in potential but dependent on foreign approval, foreign capital, and foreign control. But Senegal has had enough of waiting. It no longer asks for permission. It is taking action. The decision to refine oil domestically is not just about energy. It is about sovereignty, about ensuring that no foreign power dictates Senegal's future. This is a country that understands the power of self-reliance. It knows that economic freedom is not given, it is taken. And so, it has done what most African nations have long been denied the ability to do. It has established itself as a player in the oil refining industry, not just as an exporter of crude, but as a nation that can turn its resources into value. The Société Africaine de Raffinage (SAR) has been refining oil since 1961, but the difference today is monumental. For the first time, the refinery is processing oil extracted from Senegal's own Sangomar field. This is not just a symbolic milestone. It is an economic shift that carries consequences for Senegal's future, for Africa's place in global energy markets, and for the foreign powers that have long relied on African resources without allowing African nations to fully benefit from them. There is a reason why industrialization has been the missing piece of Africa's economic puzzle. It is not because the continent lacks talent, intelligence, or ambition. It is because the very structure of global trade has been designed to prevent Africa from taking this step. Western corporations and financial institutions have controlled access to the funding and technology required to build large-scale industries. Governments have been pressured into trade deals that lock them into resource extraction without the ability to process those resources at home. The oil industry, in particular, has been one of the most tightly controlled sectors, with Western and Gulf state firms dominating everything from drilling to refining to distribution. Senegal's decision to refine its oil is a direct challenge to this system. It is proof that Africa does not need to be a passive participant in global markets. It can dictate its terms. It can control the full production chain, from extraction to refining to export. And in doing so, it keeps more wealth within its borders, creates more jobs for its people, and strengthens its economy instead of fueling the economies of others. This move also signals something much bigger: an African energy revolution. Oil has always been one of the biggest points of exploitation for African nations. From Nigeria to Angola, crude oil has been a major export, yet the refined products have always been imported back at significantly higher prices. This absurd economic structure has kept oil-rich African nations in a constant state of dependency, ensuring that even though they possess the raw materials, they remain at the mercy of global refineries owned by foreign corporations. By expanding SAR's refining capacity by 20%, Senegal is sending a clear message. It will not remain trapped in this cycle. It is investing in the infrastructure that will allow it to refine more of its crude, reducing its need for imported petroleum products. The more Senegal refines, the less it will have to rely on foreign companies to supply fuel to its economy. This means lower costs for consumers, greater control over pricing, and a new level of economic resilience that few African nations have been allowed to achieve. This is not just about refining oil. This is about setting a precedent. If Senegal can do it, why can't others? Why should Nigeria, a country that exports over 2 million barrels of crude oil per day, still import most of its refined fuel? Why should Gabon, Angola, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, nations sitting on vast oil reserves, continue sending their crude abroad only to buy it back as gasoline and diesel at inflated prices? Senegal's bold step is forcing these questions to the surface. It exposes the absurdity of Africa's role in the global energy market and proves that there is a way out. This is what the world does not want to acknowledge, because once Africa begins refining its oil at scale, once African nations invest in their industries rather than relying on foreign-built ones, the entire economic balance shifts. The dependence on European and American refineries weakened. The monopolies that have controlled African oil for generations start to crumble. The wealth that has flowed outward for so long begins to stay on the continent. And this is where fear sets in for those who have profited from African dependence. Because this is not just about Senegal refining oil. This is about Africa realizing that it does not need to remain in the economic shadows of the world. It does not need to be a supplier of raw materials, while others dictate the prices of finished products. The flames at Senegal's refinery are more than just industrial fires. They are a symbol of resistance, a symbol of transformation. They burn with the ambition of a country that refuses to accept a future of subservience. This is not just about one refinery. This is about rewriting the economic rules that have long been used to suppress African potential. This is about Africa proving that it is capable of much more than the world has allowed it to believe. Senegal is not just refining oil. It is refining the idea of what Africa can be. And that is something the world is not ready for. Now the question is, how has the world reacted to this? For those who have controlled Africa's resources for generations, Senegal's decision to refine its oil is not just an economic shift, it is a threat to industries built on African dependency, a threat to the financial empires that have thrived on controlling the continent's wealth, a threat to the geopolitical balance that has long ensured Africa remains a supplier, never a competitor. The global economic order is not built on fairness, it is built on power. The countries that control industries do not simply dominate markets. They dictate political influence, military strategy, and global alliances. Oil has always been one of the most important weapons in this game. It fuels economies, finances governments, and determines who holds leverage in international negotiations. For a long time, Africa's role in this equation has been to provide the raw material while others make the profits. But when a country like Senegal refuses to play that role, the system begins to crack. Western governments, multinational corporations, and global financial institutions have spent decades ensuring that African nations remain dependent on external supply chains. They have used debt traps, trade agreements, and political pressure to prevent African countries from fully controlling their industries. These methods are not new. They are part of the same strategies used during colonial rule. The difference today is that they are disguised under the language of economic cooperation and international partnerships. But let's be clear, these partnerships have rarely been equal. For decades, France has maintained an economic grip over its former colonies, particularly in West Africa. The CFA franc, which is still used in 14 African countries, has been a tool of financial control, ensuring that these nations remain tied to the French economy. Even as countries like Senegal gained political independence, economic dependence remained intact. This is why the sudden shift towards self-sufficiency is so alarming to those who have benefited from this system. Refining oil is not just an industrial process, it is an assertion of independence. It is a declaration that Senegal no longer accepts being an economic pawn in someone else's game. And the world is taking notice. The headlines are telling. Some media outlets are framing Senegal's move as a shock, as if an African country refining its oil is an unexpected and unnatural event. Others are trying to downplay the significance, insisting that nothing has changed. These narratives reveal an uncomfortable truth. Many outside Africa do not want to see the continent take control of its destiny. Why? Because an independent Africa is an unpredictable Africa. A self-sufficient Africa is an Africa that does not need to ask permission before making decisions. An industrialized Africa is an Africa that competes on the global stage rather than simply supplying raw materials to wealthier nations. And this is what terrifies those who have built their power on African weakness. If Senegal can refine its oil, then what stops Nigeria from fully utilizing its vast energy reserves instead of relying on European refineries? If Senegal can produce its fuel, then why should other African nations continue importing refined petroleum at inflated prices? If one country can break the cycle, then why can't the rest? This is the real fear. It is not about oil, it is about precedent. Western powers have always justified their control over African industries by claiming that Africa lacks the expertise, the infrastructure, or the economic stability to manage these resources on its own. But Senegal is proving that these claims are false. The moment one African nation succeeds in breaking free, it exposes the fact that others have been held back, not by a lack of ability, but by a deliberate system designed to keep them dependent. And once that truth is exposed, it becomes impossible to ignore. The backlash will come. The forces that have kept Africa in economic submission will not let go easily. There will be new pressures and new tactics to maintain influence. There may be financial restrictions, sudden policy shifts from foreign investors, or attempts to destabilize the energy market in Senegal. These are the games that have been played for centuries whenever an African nation steps out of line. But the difference this time is that Senegal is not standing alone. The rise of BRICS, the strengthening of intra-African trade, and the growing economic partnerships between African nations and emerging powers like China and Russia are changing the game. The old Western-dominated order is being challenged. African countries are realizing that they do not have to rely on former colonial powers to develop. Senegal's refinery is not just about oil. It is about breaking the unspoken rule that Africa must always be the junior partner in the global economy. It is about showing that Africa is not just a supplier and not just a buyer, but a producer, a manufacturer, and a power in its own right. This is why the world is uncomfortable. This is why there is resistance. Because once one African country proves that true independence is possible, the rest of the continent will follow. And when that happens, the world will have no choice but to accept a new reality. Africa is no longer waiting to be given a seat at the table. It is building its own. Do you think Africa will stop now? Can the West stop Africa from being independent? Let us know in the comments section. Is West jealous? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about. The Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.